Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. I'm Melissa Garvey, and as Amy had mentioned, I'm the Global Director for what we call the Nature Bonds program at the Nature Conservancy. For those who aren't familiar with the Nature Conservancy, we're a global environmental organization. We're grounded in science, and we really work to find innovative solutions to some of the greatest challenges of our time. At this point, we're working to tackle climate change to try and address protecting the oceans, lands, and freshwater on this planet at an unprecedented scale. We're working to make food be able to be delivered more sustainably and have our cities be more sustainable. And we're working across the world in more than 70 countries and also right here in Idaho. Now, I have an unbelievably challenging remit today, which is to get you all excited about sovereign debt refinancing. Okay, do me a favor, I can't see all that well, but can anyone who's a sovereign debt refinancing expert raise your hand? Okay, good. This is my favorite audience. We're gonna take it easy, okay? We're gonna talk about the triple crisis, and many of you may be quite familiar with certainly the first two parts of this. Right? You're familiar with the biodiversity crisis. 70% of the world's wildlife populations have plummeted since 1970. And scientists tell us that there could be about 1 million more species that just vanish by 2050. We're also quite aware of the climate crisis. This is not an audience that I need to over-explain that to. But I think that there's a growing awareness of the intersection of how the climate crisis is really exacerbating the biodiversity crisis in the world. Whether it's wildfires or floods or heat, those are exactly the kinds of conditions that are threatening our ecosystems. And we know that right now, only about 16% of the world's lands and inland freshwaters are protected. And only about half of that, about 8% of the world's oceans are protected. I don't know if Dr. Earle is still here, but she could certainly attest to all the problems that that's creating in the world. So I know that these are massive challenges, but they're exacerbated by a third challenge. And that's unsustainable debt and a financing crisis. Because the UN estimates that there's about a $4.1 trillion gap in financing some of the critical nature-based solutions that are needed to address climate change. We also know that there's a $700 billion biodiversity funding gap. And you then add on top of that about 60% of the world's low-income countries are either facing or already in debt distress right now. So what that means is they don't have the financial ability to actually be implementing some of the commitments that they would want to be able to address both biodiversity loss and climate change. Okay, again, I can't see you all very well, but you're probably depressed, right? Okay, don't get too down because there's hope. So to address the first challenge, the biodiversity crisis, we know that protecting nature can be a way to address biodiversity collapse, right? And there's more will now than ever before. The world came together in Montreal in 2022 and committed to protecting 30% of the world's oceans, lands, and freshwater. About 200 countries signed on to that agreement. And we know that many countries have also made very ambitious commitments to the Paris Agreement. So there's hope there. There's also hope on financing. And this is where sovereign debt refinancing is going to come into play. It's not a panacea, but it is one solution. And I'm going to share a little bit more about how we have been working in this space and what we call the Nature Bonds program. Nature Bonds projects, they bring together sovereign debt refinancing, and it's using that sovereign debt refinancing and coupling it with technical assistance on science and planning and policy efforts to be able to help countries be able to make good on the commitments to protect their biodiversity and to address climate change, while at the same time also being able to close that nature finance gap and also support local communities. So how do these projects work? Again, I'm going to go easy on you as a group of experts in this field. We start with a simple agreement. we work with countries and in support of commitments for biodiversity protection and climate mitigation efforts. We work with those countries to help them refinance their debt. We're able to work with development finance institutions like the U.S. Development Finance Corporation or with multilateral development banks like the Inter-American Development Bank. We work with them. They help provide credit enhancement. Now, credit enhancement really is just guarantees or political risk insurance that can take a lot of the risk out of a debt refinancing and be able to bring in some of your standard financial institutions, whether it's Bank of America or UBS, to have there be what's a pretty standard financial transaction. So we're able to put that debt refinancing together, have those strong climate and biodiversity commitments, and then all of the savings that are part of that project flow through an independent conservation trust fund. Simple, right? One way of explaining it to those who aren't really in the finance space, and hey, I didn't come to this naturally myself, was to think about if you were to refinance your home mortgage and say you had a really generous, wealthy aunt who was going to co-sign for you. Great, huh? It might mean you might get lower interest rates or a longer repayment period, and you could take all those cost savings and you could put it into having solar panels on your roof, right? Well, look, these nature bonds projects, they're a little bit more complicated than that, and we're refinancing sovereign debt, not a home mortgage, but you can kind of get the idea of how these things work. So first step, we put these agreements together. The second step is to do planning. And when I say planning, we're talking about national level planning to create new protected areas and management plans. But what's so important is that we're able to bring science and good practices, good planning practices, to developing any of these kinds of projects. And as important is to ensure that we have all of the right stakeholders at the table too. So, various communities, indigenous peoples, those who have an interest in any of the uses of any of the natural resources are part of the planning process. We then go into implementation. And implementation can take 15 to 20 years because it's the same timeline that the debt refinancing transactions are also on. So there's financial resources that can go to things like, putting in place new protected areas, or it can go to support even putting fuel in patrol vehicles, or it could even go to helping support community groups. That implementation is just such a core part of what we all want to see. There's a lot of commitments out there, but they need that financing. Now, transparency is a key for the entire lifespan of any of these projects, because it helps us ensure that there's robust reporting not only of the financial transaction, but also we're able to give confidence that there's outcomes, real outcomes on biodiversity and climate outcomes as well. This is important for certainly our investment partners, but as well as any of the investors, as well as the public at large. And all of the reports are all on our website. You're welcome to take a look. Let me just go very, very quickly and share a little bit about the impact that we've been able to have. And I'm not going to go into detail on all of these projects, but I do want to highlight just one of them. And that's the project in Belize, where we were able to refinance about $550 million of debt and unlock $180 million in support of ocean conservation commitments. Now, Belize had made commitments to protect 30% of their ocean. That's the same commitment that each and every one of these 4 countries had also made. So we're talking about very, very large-scale, ambitious biodiversity commitments. In the case of Belize, we were also able to work with the country to have them be supporting additional commitments on, say, fisheries reform, as well as putting in place a regulatory framework for blue carbon. So these are meaningful, large-scale conservation commitments that are important for the people of Belize and have an impact on the broader world, especially when you consider the importance of Belize being home to the largest coral reef in the hemisphere, the Mesoamerican reef. I'm going to go through this very briefly, but just to highlight these 4 projects alone. And we were able to refinance more than $1.2 billion in debt and generate $400 million over the lifetime of these projects to support new conservation areas that are the size of the Gulf of Mexico. And this was just the first pilot projects we had put together, because we know that we can move far beyond the ocean space and be able to use this same approach to be able to deliver outcomes on terrestrial, freshwater, as well as climate commitments. So the ocean projects, which were recognized by the TED Audacious competition as being one of the big ideas of our time, it was just the first step, just the first bit of pioneering. You can see that these are some of the highlights of some of the outcomes that we think we might be able to deliver with this approach. And the numbers that you see here represented are about 20 to 80% of some of the Nature Conservancy's 2030 goals. So we are a massive driver for what the Nature Conservancy is hoping to be able to change in the world over the next 5 years. We're also committed to being able to unlock about $2 billion in durable finance. Now, you might think that this complexity also has high costs, but I want to assure you that actually what you're seeing is great efficiency. The projects that we've been able to put together have a multiplier effect of more than 20 times, meaning these are really good philanthropic investments to be able to deliver massive financing for conservation and climate outcomes, and to be able to both get those hard commitments in place, but to also be able to ensure that they can be implemented over time as well. I know I'm running out of time here, but I want to highlight one last thing, which is that we as the Nature Conservancy know that we alone can't do all of these debt refinancings that nature and climate change need. So we are working on a scaling approach that has two different work streams. One is making the world safe for these kinds of projects by making credit enhancement easier to come by, making it easier to use, and making sure that these kinds of projects can be done more quickly. That's the first step, what we call greening sovereign debt. The second is radical collaboration. We're working in very much an open space environment. We share how you do these projects. We've created a toolkit that's it's like a how-to manual to do a sovereign debt refinancing for biodiversity and climate. In fact, I encourage you to go to our website and check it out. It's actually kind of fun in a wonky way. But we're also working with other NGOs to help them do these kinds of projects because, like I said, we know that we alone can't do all of these projects ourselves. But what we can do is ensure that they have very high standards. So we're working to develop shared standards that work for us in the NGO world, but also work for investors as well as commercial banks. These are going to be how these kinds of projects can be delivered with high integrity and also be able to meet the pace and the scale that the world needs of us at this point. Now, we know that climate change and biodiversity collapse could be part of our future. But I want to share not just hope, but durably financed hope with all of us with these kinds of projects. Again, it's not a panacea, but it's the kind of future that we all need for people and nature to thrive together. Thank you.